In the autumn of 1437, a coroner in Worcestershire, England, recorded the death of a man named Thomas Brigman with a brevity that should genuinely unsettle you. The entry states that Brigman died of the flux following the harvest feast, which is a gentle way of saying that he ate something at the celebration marking the end of the agricultural year, developed violent dysentery within 48 hours, and was dead inside a week. He was approximately 32 years old. The coroner noted no further investigation. No one was questioned. No food was condemned. The feast continued in subsequent years without modification. Thomas Brigman was buried in the churchyard of St. Michael's with no more ceremony than his neighbour's ox would have received had it dropped in a ditch. The entry is 2 lines long. There are 14 similar entries in the same Worcestershire record for that same autumn season. Here is what makes that genuinely disturbing, and it is not the death. Death was ambient, in the 1400s in a way we are completely unprepared to understand. What is disturbing is that no one who attended that harvest feast considered the possibility that the food had killed Thomas Brigman. Not his wife, not the coroner, not the lord who hosted it. The idea that ordinary, familiar, laboriously produced food could be the mechanism of your death was simply not a conceptual category available to them. Food was what you ate. Death was what God sent. The arrow between those two things was invisible, and it would remain invisible for another 400 years. And that gap between what was killing people and what people believed was killing them is the entire story we are about to walk through together. You would not have survived a year of eating what a 15th century English peasant ate, not as a rhetorical flourish, in the specific physiological sense. The combination of nutritional deficiencies, microbial contamination, mycotoxin exposure, and seasonal starvation that constituted an ordinary peasant diet would within 12 months produce measurable and serious damage to your body. Within several years, it would very likely kill you, not through any single catastrophic event, but through the slow, grinding accumulation of damage that people in the 15th century interpreted as God's will, or an imbalance of humors, and that we now understand as the predictable physiological consequences of a diet that was simultaneously monotonous and contaminated, calorically insufficient, and microbiologically catastrophic. I am going to walk you through exactly how that happened. We will start with the bread, because the bread is where everything begins, and where several of the most spectacular failures of the medieval food system converge in a single loaf. We will end somewhere that will genuinely change how you think about the relationship between food, knowledge, and survival. But we are not close to the end yet, and it gets considerably worse before we get there. Close your eyes for a moment. Metaphorically, keep watching, and imagine the smell, not the smell of a bakery, not the warm, yeasty, golden smell of bread pulled from a modern oven. Imagine the smell of a medieval peasant's grain store in late winter, when the rye and barley sitting in a damp thatch-roofed barn since October has been slowly colonizing itself with mold for 4 months. The historian Christopher Dyer, in his foundational 2002 work, Making a Living in the Middle Ages, describes grain storage conditions of typical English peasant households as barely adequate in good years and catastrophically insufficient in bad ones. The grain was stored in sacks in corners of the main room, in outbuildings that leaked with whatever moisture it absorbed during an imperfect harvest. And it sat there all winter, slowly becoming something other than food. But the grain smell is what you need to focus on, because the grain is what is going to kill you. In the 1400s, bread was not one component of your diet. Bread was your diet. The historian Christopher Wilgar, in his 2016 work, The Culture of Food in England, 1500, estimated that bread and grain-based pottage, a thick boiled porridge made from whatever grain was available, constituted between 60 and 80% of the total caloric intake of a typical English agricultural laborer. Not 60 to 80% of carbohydrates. 60 to 80% of everything. Your entire nutritional universe revolved around a grain product that was, depending on the season and the year, either marginally adequate or genuinely dangerous. The bread itself bore no resemblance to what we call bread. White bread, made from refined wheat flour, was the bread of lords and wealthy merchants. The peasant's bread was maslin bread, or horse bread, or at the bottom of the economic ladder, a product some contemporary sources simply called black bread, a mixture of rye, barley, oats, peas, beans, and whatever else could be ground into something that held together when baked. It was dark, dense, heavy, and sour. It was baked in large round loaves meant to last a week, which meant that by the time you ate the last of it, it was already producing white and grey fuzz along its crust, and you ate it anyway. Not because you were desperate, though a phaeton you were, but because the mold on bread was not conceptually distinguishable from the mold on the walls, the mold on the stored grain, the mold that was simply part of the texture of winter life. Here is where the science enters the story, and where the story becomes genuinely terrifying. The primary grain used in peasant bread across much of medieval Europe, France, Germany, the Low Countries, northern England, was rye. Rye is hardy. It grows in poor soil in cold, wet conditions that would kill wheat. For many communities, it was not a choice. It was the only grain that would reliably grow in their soil. And rye has a catastrophic vulnerability that no medieval farmer could have known about, because the knowledge required to understand it would not exist until the late 19th century. Rye is uniquely susceptible to a fungal infection called Claviceps purpurea, which produces a growth on the seed head called an ergot, a hard, dark, purple-black body replacing the normal kernel. Ergot contains lysergic acid derivatives and vasoconstrictive alkaloids that are, in sufficient quantity, one of the most destructive substances a human being can eat. We will return to ergot shortly. The open loop is intentional. But first, let us address one of the most persistent myths about medieval peasant food, which is the image of the hearty, if humble, peasant meal. The wholesome stew, the rough bread, the simple dignity of labor, rewarded with simple sustenance. This image exists because it was constructed by the medieval aristocratic imagination and subsequently preserved by Romantic-era historians who found it aesthetically satisfying. It is almost entirely false. Here is the thing most people get completely wrong about medieval peasant nutrition. The problem was not primarily that the food was poor quality or unpleasant. The problem was that there frequently was not enough of it. And then, when there was enough, a significant portion was actively dangerous. The historian Bruce Campbell, in his 2016 study The Great Transition, calculated that English agricultural laborers in the century between 1350 and 1500 experienced what he termed persistent biological stress, visible in the skeletal record, stunted growth, high rates of childhood deficiency diseases, evidence of repeated infection cycles in bone formation. The bodies of medieval peasants are legible archives of everything they were not eating. A typical adult male agricultural laborer in 15th century England needed approximately 3,500 calories per day to sustain the physical work he was required to perform. In good years, during harvest season, he might approach that figure. In winter, he was consuming somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 calories per day, according to calculations made by the economic historian Gregory Clark in a 2007 paper examining English peasant living standards. This is not mild hunger. This is the caloric intake of someone in what we would today classify as food insecurity. And it was the recurring, predictable rhythm of every year of his life. And that should stop you for a moment. Because we are not talking about famine years. We are talking about the ordinary winter of an ordinary year. A surviving account from a priory in Norfolk from the 1430s describes the daily winter meal of servants and labourers as pottage of peas with salt and onion, with bread. That is the complete description, not a component of the meal. The meal. Here is the thing most people get completely wrong about medieval peasant access to meat. The peasants had animals. They kept cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, geese, but those animals were not primarily food. Cattle were dray-feed power. Sheep were wool. Pigs were the closest thing the medieval peasant had to a savings account, fed through the year on scraps and forage, slaughtered in November when they could no longer be afforded through winter. The November pig slaughter was one of the most significant annual events in the peasant calendar, depicted repeatedly in the seasonal illustrations of medieval manuscripts. A pig, slaughtered and properly salted, could provide preserved meat, bacon, salt pork, blood pudding through the winter months. Except that properly salted is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. Salt was expensive in the way that a critical preservative controlled by a taxed monopoly is expensive. The gabelle, the French salt tax, is famous among economic historians as one of the more spectacular examples of a government policy that made the food supply of poor people significantly more dangerous. The historian Stephen Kaplan, in his multi-volume study of the Parisian bread trade, noted that salt rationing by poor households was a standard feature of rural poverty that predictably resulted in underpreserved meat and the contamination events that followed. You stretched your salt. You used less than preservation actually required. And in January, when you opened the salt barrel, you sometimes found the preservation had failed. Sometimes you ate it anyway. And sometimes that produced the results that the coroner's records describe in their 2-line entries. Chickens were kept for eggs, not meat. Goats and cows provided milk that was raw, unpasteurized, and carrying brucellosis, bovine TB, and E. coli variants, none of which anyone could detect or name. Now, let us return to the rye. We leaf eat the ergot waiting, and it has been patient. Claviceps purpurea thrives in wet, cool conditions. The years of the early and mid-15th century in Western Europe were, as the climate historian Wolfgang Behringer documented in his 2010 study A Cultural History of Climate, characterized by increased rainfall, cooler temperatures, and exactly the damp agricultural conditions that ergot requires. Ergot infestation of rye was not a rare occurrence. It was a recurring feature of the agricultural calendar, most severe in wet years, present in lesser quantities in most years. A peasant family milling their rye in January would have noticed the dark purple-black ergot bodies in the grain. Medieval agricultural texts, including the Rerea Commoda of Pietro de Crescenzi, written in the early 14th century and widely copied through the 15th, mention black grains in rye and recommend removing them. The recommendation was sound. The compliance was imperfect. You are cold. You are hungry. You are milling grain in poor light in the pre-dawn hours before a day of physical labor. You remove the obvious dark bodies. You miss the ones that are smaller or mixed into the grain in a way that makes them hard to distinguish by feel, and some of those end up in the bread. The alkaloids produced by ergot produce 2 distinct clinical syndromes. The first is convulsive ergotism, seizures, muscle spasms, hallucinations, and what medieval observers called dancing madness, or Saint Vitus's dance, involuntary, uncontrollable movement that could persist for days or weeks. The second is gangrenous ergotism, in which the vasoconstrictive properties of the alkaloids cut off blood flow to the extremities. The hands and feet develop a burning sensation. Medieval sufferers called it St. Anthony's fire. The skin blackens, the tissue dies, the extremities fall off. The patient, if they survive, survives without their feet. In 1418, a physician named Johannes Hartlieb, practicing in Bavaria, recorded an outbreak affecting an entire village in the Rhine Valley. He described, in terms that map precisely onto gangrenous ergotism, more than 40 people losing fingers, toes, or entire hands, and feet to the burning sickness, with 3 not surviving at all. He attributed it, as medicine required him to divine punishment or demonic influence. The actual cause was sitting in their grain store. And here is the detail that should make you stare at the wall for a moment. The village did not stop eating the rye. There was nothing else. The rye was what they had. The alternative to eating contaminated rye was not eating at all, and not eating killed you more certainly, and more quickly. So you kept eating, and you kept hoping. And when the burning started in your feet, you went to the shrine of St. Anthony, because that was the framework available to you. And sometimes you recovered when the new grain came in, and the contaminated stores were exhausted, and you thanked God for the miracle. And the following autumn you stored your rye in the same damp conditions, because there were no other conditions available, and the cycle continued. None of it was stupidity. It was rational behavior in a world without germ theory, without mycology, without the conceptual tools to perceive an invisible fungus as the mechanism of a bodily catastrophe. They were thinking carefully and correctly with the information they had, and the information they had was wrong in ways that no individual observation could have corrected. We have not yet talked about the water, and the water is arguably the most important conversation we need to have. The medieval village water supply drew from wells, streams, and ponds in direct proximity to agricultural and residential activity. Animals defecated near water sources. Latrines were positioned by habit rather than by any understanding of groundwater contamination. The historian Richard Holt, in his 1988 study The Mills of Medieval England, noted that complaints about mill pond water quality in medieval English legal records are nearly universal, not because medieval people understood contamination, but because they could smell and see that something was wrong. The standard solution was to convert water into ale, low-alcohol fermented grain beverage brewed without hops, served at every meal including breakfast, given to children from a young age. The fermentation process killed most waterborne pathogens. Ale was safer than water. This was understood empirically without being understood mechanistically, and it was correct, brewed in small batches that soured within days, consumed almost before it had finished fermenting. Let us pause for a moment of grim comedy, because the medieval food system occasionally produced situations of such bureaucratic absurdity that the only appropriate response is to briefly laugh before remembering that people were dying. In 1390, and regularly before, and a feat of that, the English crown issued the assize of bread and ale, stipulating the correct weight and price of bread at various grain prices, with penalties for bakers selling underweight loaves. Bakers caught selling short measure bread could be dragged through the streets on a wooden frame with the offending loaf tied around their neck. This was the entirety of the medieval food safety system. You could not be punished for selling contaminated bread. You could not be punished for brewing ale from moldy grain. You could not be punished for storing grain in conditions that promoted ergot growth, or for selling salt pork that had failed to preserve properly. The entire regulatory apparatus of the English state, as it applied to food, was focused on the one variable that had essentially nothing to do with whether eating the bread would kill you, which tells you everything about what medieval governments understood about food safety. They understood fraud, the deliberate manipulation of weight and measure, because fraud was a moral and economic category they possessed. They did not understand contamination, because contamination required a theory of invisible agents causing bodily harm, and that theory did not exist. The baker who sold you ergot-contaminated rye bread was not defrauding you. He did not know it was contaminated. He was eating the same bread himself. That was the actual system. None of it worked. Now let us talk about what happened when the food system failed completely. not in the chronic grinding way we have been describing, but catastrophically. The winter of 1437 to 1438 was, by contemporary chronicle accounts across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, catastrophically cold. The English chronicler Thomas Gascoigne, writing in Oxford in the late 1430s, described a winter in which the Thames froze so hard that men walked upon it as upon dry land. And the cold was such that the grain in the ground was killed, and the poor did eat such things as they could find, and many died. The harvest of 1437 failed across much of Western Europe. The harvest of 1438 failed in much of France. By 1440, a significant portion of the rural poor of northern France were in what we would today classify as acute food insecurity trending toward famine. The historian Guy Bois, in his detailed regional study of 15th century Normandy, documented the mortality and migration patterns of several Norman villages through this period. In the village of Vieux-Fumé, the tax rolls show the population declining from 247 households in 1430 to 183 in 1442, minus a loss of roughly a quarter in 12 years. What the records show, with great clarity, is that the households that disappeared first were the smallest, the landless labourers, the smallholders, with no grain reserve. The margin was the first casualty. What did people eat when the grain ran out? The chronicle and legal records of the 1430s are a catalogue of substitutions proceeding in a clear sequence of desperation. First, you ate the grain set aside for spring planting, a decision that solved this winter's famine at the cost of next year's harvest, which is why famine years in the medieval record almost always appear in clusters. Then you ate the animals kept for breeding, the cow that would have calved, the ewes that would have lambed. Then you ate the animals kept for labor, the ox that ploughed your field, whose loss meant that even when the harvest recovered, your capacity to exploit it was permanently diminished. And then you ate things that were not conventionally food, bark, stripped from trees, and ground into a flour substitute, grass boiled in water to make a green liquid with the approximately imate nutritional value of hot water, acorns and beech nuts, mildly toxic in large quantities due to tannin content, consumed because the alternative was not eating at all. The historian William Chester Jordan, in his definitive study of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, recorded accounts of people consuming the dung of animals and the bodies of those already dead, phrases appearing in enough independent sources across enough distinct regions to be understood as genuine documentation rather than rhetorical excess. Thomas Brigman, whose death opened this script, died at a harvest feast. He died at a celebration. He died eating what was, by the standards of his community, good food, the best food of the year. He died because a harvest feast in 1437, Worcestershire, was assembled from ingredients that had been stressed, partially contaminated, imperfectly preserved, and prepared with water we would classify today as actively hazardous. He was celebrating, and the food killed him anyway. We should address one more myth before the ending, because it is perhaps the most consequential one. The myth is that medieval peasants lived off the land in a direct, self-sufficient relationship, hunting, gathering, fishing, foraging in ways that diversified their diet and compensated for grain agriculture's limitations. This image of the medieval peasant as a kind of pre-industrial hunter-gatherer is pervasive in popular culture and almost entirely incorrect for the period we are discussing. By the 15th century, in the densely settled agricultural communities of England, France, and Germany, wild food resources had been systematically restricted by feudal law in ways that left the peasant with almost no legal access to them. The forest was the lord's forest, the deer, the boar, the hare. These were the lord's animals. Poaching was prosecuted with genuine vigor through the royal forest courts. A man caught taking a deer could lose a hand, be imprisoned, or be blinded, depending on jurisdiction. The historian Jean Birel, in a 2006 essay on Mediterranean poaching in the English Historical Review, analyzed forest court records and found that prosecuted poachers were overwhelmingly poor agricultural laborers, people who were, in her careful phrasing, hunting from necessity rather than sport. Foraging for mushrooms was generally permitted and genuinely practiced as a supplement to the grain diet. But mushroom foraging without formal mycological training meant relying on folk knowledge that was sometimes correct and sometimes catastrophically wrong. The death cap mushroom, Amanita phalloides, is responsible for the majority of fatal mushroom poisonings in Europe to this day. It is white, relatively small, and can be confused with several edible species by someone relying on informal visual identification. Its amatoxins cause severe liver and kidney failure on a delayed timeline. Symptoms do not appear for 6 to 24 hours following consumption, by which point the toxins have already been absorbed and the damage is underway. By the time a person understood that something was wrong, they were already dying. They were treated with bloodletting and emetics, interventions that did nothing for the underlying pathology and may have accelerated death. None of it worked. And that phrase applies to almost everything a 15th century person could do in response to food-related health crises. The interventions available, medical, religious, practical, were not effective against the actual mechanisms causing harm, because those mechanisms were invisible. The saint's shrine could not cure gangrenous ergotism, because ergotism was not caused by divine displeasure. The bloodletting could not treat mushroom toxicity, because mushroom toxicity was not an imbalance of humors. The prayers could not end a famine caused by climate instability, because the famine was not a divine punishment. The people who prayed and submitted to bloodletting were not irrational. They were applying every tool their civilization had developed for managing suffering. The tools were aimed at the wrong targets. That is not stupidity. That is the tragedy of incomplete knowledge. In the spring of 1445, a monk at the Abbey of St. Victor near Paris, whose name we know as Brother Anselm from a surviving manuscript colophon, wrote a brief addition to the abbey's chronicle. He had been asked by local peasants near the village of Pontoise whether there was some property of grain or water that might explain why some years brought widespread illness, while others did not. He wrote that he could not answer them. He wrote that the question seemed to him worthy of philosophical investigation, but that he lacked the means to pursue it. He wrote that the peasants seemed more observant of nature than is generally credited, and that their question was not one he could answer better than they could. Brother Anselm was one of the most educated men of his generation. He could read Greek and Latin, had access to the full library of a major Parisian abbey, and was familiar with the medical writings of Galen and Avicenna, and he could not answer the question, because the answer was claviceps purpurea, and improperly preserved meat and waterborne pathogens and mycotoxin-contaminated grain stores, and none of those words or concepts existed in any language available to him. The peasants of Pontoise were asking the right question in 1445. The answer would not begin to emerge for another 200 years. With the development of early microscopy, it would not be fully systematized until the 19th century, with germ theory. The interval between the question and the answer contains centuries of suffering by people who were, as Brother Anselm correctly observed, paying close attention to the world around them. They were not incurious. They were asking questions that their civilization had not yet developed the tools to answer. So let us compress everything we have walked through and let it land together, because separately these things are grim. Together, they are something else. You have a diet that is 60 to 80% grain in good years and 100% in bad ones. That grain is stored in conditions that promote mold and fungal contamination throughout the winter. A significant portion contains ergot alkaloids that cause seizures, hallucinations, and the gangrenous destruction of your extremities. The water used to cook and drink comes from sources contaminated by agricultural runoff and human and animal waste. The ale that makes the water safe disappears in late winter, precisely when your immune system is most depleted. The meat that provides your only protein is preserved with insufficient salt and fails in ways you cannot detect before eating. The mushrooms you forage occasionally contain toxins that produce no symptoms until the damage is irreversible. The medical system available is aimed entirely at mechanisms that do not exist. And the food safety regulatory apparatus of your government is focused exclusively on whether your baker is shorting your loaf by a few ounces. And then, perhaps once or twice in your lifetime, the harvest fails. Not because you did anything wrong, because the summer was wet and cold in ways that no one had the tools to predict or prevent. The sequence begins: seed grain eaten, breeding animals slaughtered, things that are not food consumed, because possible is better than certain. The communities that survive are the ones with slightly more margin. The communities that do not survive are simply, quietly, absent from the next decade's tax rolls. Thomas Brigman ate a harvest feast in 1437 and was dead within a week. The coroner wrote 2 lines. Nobody thought it was unusual. And in the barn behind his house, the rye his family had threshed and stored for the winter was already, in the cool, damp October air, beginning to grow the dark purple-black bodies that would replace the grain kernels they needed to eat. They could not see it. That was the whole problem, and there was nothing to be done about it. They could not see it.